This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Magnus Carlsen taking on Richard Rapport at the 2022 FIDE World Blitz Championship. And Magnus starts the game with 1d4, and Richard offers a transposition to the French, which Magnus Carlsen accepts. What variation of the French are we going to get? Bishop to b4. This is the win-hour variation. It is the most popular response to knight c3, and now we have a trade on c3. Now the center in these lines is incredibly close. Generally, black pushes that c-pawn down to c4 at some point, and the center becomes completely locked. White starts playing on the king side. Black starts playing on the queen side. We are going to get an old-school barn burner here as Magnus shoves his pawn up to h4, grabbing space on the king side, and there goes the pawn up to h5. Richard prevents its progress by playing h6. You don't want to let white go h6 in these types of positions and weaken the dark square complex on the king side. The players continuing to develop their pieces, the bishop coming out to b5 with check, and now dropping back to d3. Magnus making sure that he keeps his bishop pair alive, and there is that c4 move. Richard takes the opportunity to play the move with tempo, now establishes a bishop onto a4. The idea of that move is to prevent white from pushing the pawn up to a4 and opening up a beautiful developing square on a3 for his dark squared bishop. And Magnus is going to have to decide where he wants his dark squared bishop to live. It's essentially hemmed in by all of white's center pawns. Maybe he wants to put it on f4 and offer further support for the e5 pawn, and that's exactly what he does. Bishop coming out to f4, and Rapport completes his minor piece development with knight to a6, kind of an unconventional move. Maybe later on, once the queen moves away from c7, Richard wants to dial that knight back around to c7, and then maybe to b5 and put pressure on white's king side, black castling queen side, and the queen side is a very safe place to be for black's king because it's so hard for white to open up that queen side. The a file is totally blocked by that monster bishop on a4. King b7 by Rapport. Magnus circling back to f1 with his knight. Now forward he goes to e3. That knight nicely centralized. And maybe there will one day be a sack on c4, but it's way too early to talk about sacrifices. Neither side really has anything going as of yet. And Richard has been playing at lightning speed. He is up a full minute on the clock. He still has 3 minutes on the clock, all of the time that he started with. And he continues to play at breakneck speed. Knight e7 to c6 goes Rapport, bringing more beef to the king side. And Magnus, he's playing it slow, pushing the pawn up to g3, probably preparing to tuck his king away on g2 and make sure that his rooks are connected. Now, eventually, black might try something like g7, g5, or even f7, f6. White can play on the king side, but black can also play on the king side, especially since white's king is now parked on g2. And I think Richard is starting to do just that. Queen e8 to g8. That queen could kind of fianchetto itself on h7 to put more pressure on c2, or it could support a push of the g pawn. And Magnus continues to fall behind on the clock, as you can see him there nervously fiddling with the only pawn that he has captured thus far. No, that's a bishop. He hasn't captured any pawns. The position's still very locked up as he moves his rook up to b1. And indeed, Rapport putting his queen on that very safe h7 square as it aims at the c2 pawn. Magnus, though, his bishops now look kind of imposing. The bishop on f3 is x-raying the king on b7, and don't fall asleep on a potential knight sacrifice on c4 in order to open that diagonal up. Black's bishop on a4 is very nicely placed, but it's also kind of hemmed in by the knight on c6 as Rapport carefully brings his king back to b8, but knight takes c4 almost works. After d takes c4, the bishop on a4 actually defends the knight on c6, so it's not possible just yet. Magnus is down a full minute and 15 seconds as he moves his queen down to e2, kind of a cagey, old-school, closed center fight. Both players posturing for position, and in these types of positions, you want to make sure that you are prepared when the center actually opens up. And it's likely to open up eventually because the players, they don't have infinite patience. But who is going to strike first? Who is going to initiate the first battle? And finally, the Hungarian Grandmaster takes a prolonged think as he moves his rook from d8 to c8. He's just trying to make sure that his ranks are buttressed on the queen side, that his knights are fully protected. And Magnus, he is making motions to attack on the queen side. Rook to b2, preparing to double his rooks on the b file. Maybe even a rook sacrifice on b6 is possible. Everything is possible in these types of positions. But the knight, it jumps out to b5, and that's a fork on two of Magnus's pawns. But the a3 pawn is largely untouchable because the rook will slide from h1 to a1 and pin black's minor pieces on the a file. But Magnus, there he goes. Knight takes d5, and we have our first sacrifice of the game. We have waited patiently, and with 1 minute on the clock, Magnus grabs the pawn on d5, and he might want to play e6 check and open up a discover check on black's king. Let's see what he does. Yes, indeed. There goes the e-pawn. Now his bishops are open, and the light-scored bishop can jump into the action with a capture on d5. But first, Magnus takes on f7, and he has 2 pawns for the sacrificed piece, a monster pawn on f7, and a prospect of capturing on d5. But he might have missed that response. Queen h7 jumps out to f5. It defends d5. It attacks f7. Report for the time being, keeping everything protected. Can Magnus find a way to add fuel to the fire? He really doesn't want to go bishop g4. He can win back the exchange, but that bishop is worth its weight in gold. Speaking of gold, what a move by Magnus. He sacks another rook, and he does that in order to vacate the path to e7, pushing black's king to an incredibly vulnerable square. The king moves up to a6, and Magnus is now currently down a rook and a piece. He's going to recapture the knight on b4, and he does so with his queen. But now, the bishop on a4, it's finally vulnerable. It's under attack, and if you lose the bishop, you also lose the knight. But the bishop, it's so slippery, it captures on c2. Magnus playing a full rook down, but black's king is on the cusp of getting checkmated. The knight drops back to c7. Magnus with 35 seconds on his clock. A rook down. Report, he doesn't seem to believe it. He kind of raises his eyebrows, calling the world champion's bluff. Magnus captures the knight on c7. And now, the bishop drops back to f4. Report did not recapture. He instead targets the bishop on f3, and now he can win the rook on h1 with a check on e4. Will he win that rook in the corner? And will his king survive the aftermath? Magnus has a potentially devastating check that he can deliver on the b5 square, driving the king back to b7, and then he might have another check on d7, but Report, he doesn't buy it. There's the check on e4, and a little hesitation as he captures the rook on h1. This is unbelievable. The world champion is down a rook and an exchange, and he keeps attacking as if nothing's the matter. He pushes his pawn to a5. He plays quietly, down 10 points in material. a4, a5, threatening to drive the pawn up to a6 and lock black's king in the corner on a8. And it's important to notice that white's king on g4 is actually quite safe. Black's rooks have no open files to operate on. So in a way, white's attacking firepower outweighs what Richard Report has, even though he's a full rook and an exchange up. And now the Hungarian Grandmaster drops to 53 seconds on the clock. You can see the signs of anxiety. There goes the pawn. Up to a6 it goes. And I think Magnus might have been able to play f3 there and then promoted to a queen and captured on d5. But that opportunity was missed. Instead, he sacrifices his f-pawn and drives his queen to d7, a counter-sacrifice on f4. And Richard Report has succeeded in finally breaching the gates. Now he's got a bunch of queen checks, queen g2 check. He's got a perpetual if he wants it. He does have a perpetual check if he wants it. Queen takes f2 check. He can continue checking on g2 and f2 because Magnus's king, it cannot go up to f5. It will get skewered on h3. And he's got exactly one attacking piece left. He cannot give up his queen by any means. And another check on g2. Will the Hungarian Grandmaster accept the draw? He takes his time. He can even think until he's got 1 second left. Queen h2 check is a draw. He has another check with a pawn, and he fearlessly goes g5 check. He sacks the pawn, and I think he's done that in order to play h5. The king is driven up to g5, or will it move back to f3? Carlsen zigzagging and meandering and trying to escape the wrath of the black queen, and he grabs his king. He hasn't released it yet, and now he does. King f3 is his decision. And another check on h1. Report still has a perpetual check in his pocket, but clearly he wants more. Carlsen down to 14 seconds. King back to f2. And another check, this time on h4. And Report, he could force a queen trade on g4 if he wants to, but that's not the end of the story. He will be a rook up in an endgame, but Carlsen will have two menacing connected pass pawns. We could get a pawn race with Report sending his b-pawn down the board. That would be crazy, and we're going to get it. Queen g4 check. Report continues to play for a win. And there go the pawns. b5, f5, b4, f6. Who will promote first? They might promote at the same time. White might end up with two queens on the board. And this is insane. This is impossible to calculate. Both players down to 20 seconds. B takes c3 by Report. There goes Magnus's f-pawn and now his g-pawn. And you never say this, but which queen is Magnus going to make? He makes the queen on f8. Oh, g8 queen would have been met with queen g1 check. And now we're going to get another series of crazy checks. Queen g1 check by Report. Where is Magnus going to go? He has to go to the h file. He cannot go to the f file. He's going to get skewered on f2. And the king continues to zigzag. King g6. I still think Report has a perpetual check if he wants it. But if he doesn't take it, he could very well get mated if he's not careful. That king on a8 is still boxed in by the pawn on a6. That's the unsung hero of White's attack. More checks on h4 and on g4. 5 seconds by Magnus. King h6, another implicit draw for, and again, Report goes for it with c3.
And Magnus with 2 seconds on the clock. He's got to move his queen back. And he threatens mate on b7. Oh my goodness. There's a mate threat on b7. There's a mate threat on d5. Report circles his queen around toward the center. Magnus drops back to g5. More checks with the black queen. This time, Report checking on the diagonal. Magnus with 2 seconds on the clock as he made that move. Queen e8. Oh, but he blundered g8 queen. Oh my goodness. Magnus makes the second queen, and if Report captures it, he gets checkmated on b7. Magnus might win this game. Report has to start checking again. But this time, with 2 queens on the board, White might actually escape the checks. Rook h8, king g5. The king is sheltered by one of White's queens, and the other queen is going to do the checkmating. I think Magnus is going to win. King up to f6. Report is running out of checks. Black's queen is driven back. The king moves up to e7. There's still a mate threat on d5. And queen g8 check leads to a back rank checkmate. Magnus leans back in disbelief. He has won the game, and what a game it was. You can see laughter from both players there. And if you enjoyed this incredible game, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these videos. Thank you for watching.